Welcome to the She's Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Aloha and mahalo for being here today for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. I'm on the island of Kauai, where I'm here for a little vacation, but I'm also recording podcasts and doing some warm weather training in preparation for the Epic 5 Ultras that I'll be running in September. I have to admit that I have underestimated the heat and me adjusting to it in terms of running. It's maybe only 20 degrees warmer than what I've been running in Seattle, but it's really kind of exhausted me. It's about 80 degrees out. But the kicker is that at 80 degrees, it's about 40 degrees cooler than it will be when I run 155 miles across the Namib Desert in Namibia next year. So yeah, it'll be upwards of 120 degrees there. So I have nothing to complain about at the moment. Anyway, it's been a great way for me to test out some new gear, run some long miles, and see how my body needs to be fueled. And those long miles I'm running, it's along this beautiful coastal path in Kapa'a, and that's on the island's east coast. And I'm actually posting photos on Facebook and Instagram, so you can check those out. Anyway, if I have to tap away on my laptop, there is no better spot than to be sitting on the lanai of our hotel and looking out at palm trees and the ocean. So I am not complaining at all. With regards to today's episode, you could probably say that it was recorded in a location that's the complete opposite of Hawaii in terms of both distance and environment. It took place in Greenwich Village, New York City. Today's conversation is with a longtime friend of mine, Vasu Varadhan. We figured we've known each other for about 35 years. And though we haven't stayed closely connected over those 35 years, we've stayed connected enough so that when I'm in New York or she's in Seattle, we try to get together and we have a good conversation and a good laugh together. Vasu and I met when I was in college, and she was visiting for a special presentation. It was an event being held at the university that I attended in Pennsylvania, and I think I'm pretty sure she was a speaker at that event. Vasu holds a PhD in media studies from NYU, and there she's currently a member of the faculty at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Now, she's taught a wide range of interdisciplinary seminars on media theory, identity in a multicultural world, ancient Indian literature and South Asian literature, and we do get into some of that and what she's currently teaching in this conversation. Now, I was really eager to chat with her because she recently published her first book, On My Own Terms, A Journey Between Two Worlds. This is a memoir that chronicles not only the early years of her life, which included her struggles as an immigrant, first growing up in the U.S., living in many ways a very traditional Indian life, but then also moving to India in her early teens, where there she was very Americanized. She was an Americanized Indian. And then it goes through describing her arranged marriage, which took place at the age of 16. Now, when you listen to this conversation, I think you'll come away with a better understanding of the immigrant experience, both for older generations and younger generations, but we cover many other topics here, including how she began working on her book shortly after the death of her eldest son in the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation, and if you do, please take a moment to share it with a friend. The topics we cover are broad enough that there's something here for everyone, but in particular, perhaps you know other immigrants who would enjoy her point of view and thoughts around this. Leave a review or a rating on iTunes, and please consider joining our Patreon community at shesboldpodcast.com/Patreon. Patreon. Supporters receive access to bonus content in the form of additional questions I ask of guests. In the case of Vasu, I ask her about her secret ambition if she were to have an alternate life or career, and I know the answer will surprise you. Again, this bonus content is only for Patreon supporters, and really, you can support the show for as little as $1 a month. Okay, with that, please enjoy this conversation with Vasu Varadhan. Before we started recording, I asked you how long you had lived here, because it was a long time ago when I was last in this apartment. Do you remember when I was last here? I think you might have cooked for me, too.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. Was that, we've known each other for...
Let's see, I've known you since you were an undergrad.
Yeah, 83, 93,
So
35 years? How could that be?
Yes, I think it's been 35 years.
Oh my gosh. You haven't aged.
Oh, I have. I have. Yeah, the body says otherwise.
Well, you're in great shape.
I take good care of myself.
Yeah. What do you do to take care of yourself?
I practice yoga, which has been, and it's the Mysore Ashtanga is quite, when I say rigorous, it's a very disciplined practice. So it's a sequence of asanas that you follow. You have to do them in sequence. And I find that has strengthened, my bones. I have good bone density. And
how long have you been doing that?
I've been doing, the Ashtanga I've been doing now 3 years, going into my 4th year. And then I practiced, vinyasa yoga, I think since 1997.
Have you noticed a difference in the 3 years since you were doing the...
Yes. In the sense is that it's improved, a lot of my breathing, my flexibility, and I feel energized. And it's a nice way to start my day.
You go out to a class, is that right?
Yes, I go to a studio right down on Bleecker Street.
Do you try to do it here at home too, or does that just not work?
I do when I travel. I do it in the hotel room because it's a sequence that, you sort of now it's... from memory,
right.
I can do it in my sleep, I guess. And I found that has been very good for me, both mentally and physically.
You're wearing a sari now. What do you do your yoga in?
Oh, sweatpants.
Oh, you do? I've never seen you in sweatpants.
I know. And what's funny is the people in my yoga class, if they see me in the neighborhood, they don't recognize me.
Bet.
They go right past me.
Yeah.
And I always go, hi. And they go, Vasu? And I go, yeah, that's me.
Oh, that's
And they go,
so funny.
oh, you look so nice. I never seen you.
Oh, that's so funny. I want to come back and just go to your yoga class just to see you. Something different.
I'll have to do like the Indian movies, like sari change, like every other scene.
Yes. Oh, I love it.
I'll do that.
Oh, that's great. Well, you just came out with a new book, with your first book.
Right.
Right. And that came out in the fall, On My Own Terms, A Journey Between Two Worlds. And I haven't finished it, but I've just started reading it. And your writing is beautiful, for one thing.
Thank you.
And I am so excited just to dive into it more. Just to give a little bit of background too, you have a PhD in media studies at NYU.
That's correct.
And then you're a professor there as
I am.
well. What are you teaching now?
Well, this semester I'm not teaching, but I teach an interdisciplinary seminar, which is sort of a theoretical course in the ways in which technology and culture interact. And so we go through various frameworks in which to understand the growth and impact of technology. And, some authors are very optimistic about the future with technology. Others are more pessimistic and guarded. And so the students, we weigh sort of the strengths and weaknesses of these ways of looking at technology. And so we're not interested so much in the course about the hardware and, all the things that technology can do, but focus more on issues of authority, privacy, democracy, the economic divide perhaps between those who can afford, things like an iPhone, which is quite expensive, or even cable. There's often an assumption when you live in a city like New York that everybody has access to technology. So we probe a lot of issues.
Where do you fall on that issue, whether it's good or bad, or are you just indifferent about it?
No, I'm not indifferent about it. I think, we've reached a point where there's been a backlash against technology, the recent elections, with the interference with Facebook.
And privacy issues.
And privacy. I also think the big Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Google have really monopolized culture. I think there's a danger where we think because we have access to information, we have access to knowledge. And I think there's a difference between the two.
Mm-hmm. That's a great distinction.
And I think we're, again, living in a time where truth is under attack, under fire. This idea of fake news, post-truth. I think these, to me, are sort of frightening in terms of the larger political question of democracy and people's right to know. So I'm wary about technology. I understand that, it has its advantages in several fields, in medicine, in industry. I mean, again, there are uses for technology that are positive. But I think, again, it's grown exponentially. And, Marshall McLuhan always said technology is put out before it's thought out. And I think now, especially with this emphasis on big data, that we have started to reduce human problems to what can be quantified. We raise problems that technology can solve, rather than thinking more deeply about what kinds of questions we should be asking. So if something can be quantified, then you get the data and then you ask the question. It seems to me that that's sort of not the right way to go about, addressing what concerns human beings.
As a teacher, a professor, and someone who is leading discussions about this, do you see a path where there can be a change, where we can take this into our own hands and have some control over it? And I'm not just talking about an individual basis, like I'm going to quit Facebook, or I'm going to use another search engine other than Google, but I'm talking about really moving the discussion, much further ahead and being able to take these things into our own hands, whether it's working with politicians and getting some control over the privacy issues, for example. Is there something that we can do, in your opinion?
It's a hard question to answer, primarily because these technologies are so addictive. I mean, I do have students who try getting off Facebook, and then they very often will say to me, that FOMO that they call it.
The fear of missing out.
Missing out. And their argument to me is that the culture at large values all the social media, so that if you go into a job interview and if you tell them, I don't use social media, it's seen as a drawback.
Well, then there's something wrong with you if you're not willing to put yourself out there.
And so I find, that even with what has happened, with Facebook, with the elections, etc., a part of me feels that not enough people are concerned about the privacy issues. I think Europe, because of their history, with the Nazis, fascism, the Stasi police in Germany, they know what it is not to have their individual rights. They know what it means when it's taken away. Here in America, I think people almost readily give up their privacy for the sake of consumption. And it's a hard call in the sense is, the people there are ways in which you can be an activist using, digital media. And I think, like, sometimes my students will tell me that you can connect with people across the globe and share your ideas, which may not be possible, in the past. And that can bring about perhaps more of a global community,
More understanding.
more understanding. But again, research shows that most people tend to be rather parochial and insular and keep their friends within their own sort of network. Like, say, it's like most people in the United States communicate with people inside the United States, not necessarily
Abroad. Yeah.
So it's a hard call, Beth. I'm not sure. As long as these companies have the corporate control that they have, I think change is, if it happens at all, will happen extremely slowly and probably just happen on a very small scale.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Yeah.
I heard a podcast recently, and I'll have to look it up and then add it to the show notes. But I heard a podcast with a gentleman. He has a book out called Zooked. And yeah, it takes a second for that to sink in. Yeah. And he talks all about Facebook, and he's pretty knowledgeable, although I think some of the things I've later learned maybe weren't quite true, just because I talked to a friend who works at Google to verify some of this information. But I think in general, his information is good. But he talks about, and I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge about this, he talks about, what happened, with the elections and how we were fed information and how our news feeds, kind of fed into that, and what the Russians had done for 2 years to kind of, it was really very predatory. I mean, if you think about it in those terms, they were very predatory in terms of gaining our trust for a couple of years and then really influencing the elections. And I hadn't realized the depth of this until I heard this podcast, and really he talked about this whole thing. And it horrified me to the extent that I've thought about deleting my own Facebook account and my own Instagram account where I'm not quite as active. But it's really difficult because, as you know, I run my business.
Yes.
I rely on Facebook, for my business. And I've really thought about how can I pull myself off of it. I couldn't and still have as successful a business. At least that's what I tell myself. But it is, we are in a bad position now because we're so reliant upon it.
I think we can make ourselves critically aware, and perhaps, like I often tell my students, don't rely on one source of news. See, part of the problem, I think, with much of social media is the serious and the trivial get equal importance. And so you're reading about, an earthquake or people dying or a mass shooting, and then you get something about the Kardashians.
Right, or the kitty cats.
Yeah,
cat videos,
and so there is... you see, as I said, sort of the more serious news with trivial stuff. And in your mind, you don't differentiate between the two.
Well, I think too, and I had no idea our conversation was going to go down this path, but I absolutely love it. So I appreciate it. I'm glad to know what you're teaching. It's great. But I want to just bring up one other thing too, and I may have talked about this on the podcast already. But this thing recently with the parents who were paying to get their children into university, and I'm sure that strikes with you because you're a professor at NYU, right? So I'm sure you have a special feeling about that. But the thing is that blew up so big.
Yes.
And you know what? It's a terrible thing. And it's really crappy for people who are honestly trying to get their kids into school, or for the children who are trying to get into school. But you know what? We got bigger fish to fry.
That's right. See, nobody at the, when they were talking about what these celebrities did and other people, they also don't talk about these legacy students. You take something like Harvard. Somebody in your family went to Harvard. It doesn't matter how you did on your SAT or ACT. You're immediately in, and there is, I think what the issue is this meritocracy that is endemic here in America. And, the fact that, without getting into all the detail about parenting, I think they're called like snowplowing something, the kind of metaphors or similes, whatever it is that we come up with. But this idea somehow that failure is a bad thing,
Or a second choice of school is a bad
Yes.
thing.
Yeah. I mean, again, there was maybe I'll email this article to you, but David Brooks had a wonderful piece in the New York Times a few days ago, last week maybe it was. It was called the moral peril of meritocracy. It's a beautiful piece that he wrote in the New York Times, and just how we shield the younger generation from failure, adversity. Somehow we want to program them to be successful in everything they do. Of course, this is a class issue. When you take students, minority students, sadly, they've been programmed for nothing but failure. But students who come, again, from a particular upper middle class and even higher, they don't know what it is not to do well.
Well, let me go back there for a second. So you're saying immigrant students are programmed for failure.
Not immigrants. What I meant...
Or I'm sorry, maybe you didn't say immigrants. You said...
when I was talking about minorities, I was talking
minorities.
mainly about those who come from disadvantaged, economic homes and, socioeconomic backgrounds. You go to the New York City, school system. They have ambition, but they've been told you're not going to make it.
By teachers or by
teachers, I think. And, there's a push now in New York, in some of the elite public schools like Stuyvesant and Bronx Science. In Stuyvesant recently, they took only 6 or 7 black students. It's predominantly Asian, in fact. And then, the mayor now is thinking of, doing away with the test, and making it easier for students of, particularly black and Hispanic students, to be admitted. But then again, is that really the solution to this problem? Because very often you take a student who gets in, all right, and that's really, more to fulfill what the mayor wants and perhaps what the student wants. Very often they don't get the support system once they're there. And then there's another kind of exclusion that takes place when they're in the school. Everybody knows they're there because
of special
circumstances. And I sort of feel you have to look at it structurally and begin with the early education system and the public school system. And that's really where the resources need to go. I have friends who teach in the inner city schools, and most of the time they spend is in policing the students rather than teaching them. And everything from, simple, box of chalk to a blackboard. There are just no facilities, and we're not putting money in that.
Right. And then we could probably unwind that even more and say, if they were eating better, if they were sleeping better, if they were maybe even practicing 5 minutes of yoga or meditation in a class each morning.
And you have nothing but fast food around where they live.
Right. And then it would change the dynamics completely again. So it's so much.
Yeah. I mean, again, yeah.
Well, thanks for that. And thank you for the work that you're doing there too. It sounds really amazing. And
I don't know. I see as an educator, like I told my students, the first day of class, I said, we're not here to find the answers. We're here to find what questions we need to ask. And I tell them that. I said, I want you to think deeply about what kinds of questions can we raise, all right, about what we're studying. And not say that, not look at things in a binary way and say, yes, Facebook is good, Apple is good, Google is bad, not to think in those kinds of, polarities. And also to look historically before we even had any of, digital media.
Mm-hmm. Which wasn't that long ago.
No.
But for many, it has been in their lifetime.
It's
been all of their life.
Exactly. And that, so we go back, without going into great detail, we go back to the oral tradition. How did people transmit knowledge at that time? Whom did they regard as an authority figure? The epic tradition, what can we learn from that? What purpose would it have served? And actually the value of storytelling, like what stories are we telling ourselves today? So there's always, what I call this sort of, I use the term diachronic, meaning looking over a period of time, historical time, to see how technology has, played a role in culture. And the students very often, in the beginning, they balk. They go, oh, why are we reading all this stuff? And then as the course progresses, like I always tell them, we never leave a book behind. I said we'll be in conversation. And that's a key part of the way I teach, is I want the students to have the books converse with one another, and I want them to converse with the books. And then we try to converse together in the classroom. And I'm very fortunate that I teach in an interdisciplinary program. The classes are small, meaning, the 22 to 25 maximum is students, and we're able to run it seminar style. And so students know that they need to come prepared for the discussion. I don't really lecture. I'll raise a few questions, and then everybody's,
They have to be prepared to join in the
yes, to
dialogue.
give an informed answer, rather than saying, well, I went out with my friend and, all she did was take pictures of the food, not that kind of thing, but what is the larger issue that's going on here? Yeah.
Well, thanks for having that discussion, because I think it's really important right now. I'm glad that people are talking about it. I think it's very important. So your book, and just again, thank you so much for the background and what you're doing now. Your book came out in the fall, and
November, right?
In
after
November,
Thanksgiving,
right? Can you give kind of just a high level overview of what the book is about? Because I know it doesn't cover your entire life, which I agree with what other people have written. I've seen the Amazon reviews, and they want part 2 of it. I want part 2 also. Already I want part 2. But can you just give kind of a high level overview of what the book is about?
The book is about growing up as an Indian girl in Queens, in this case, New York, but in the suburb of Queens in the mid-1940s through the mid-1950s. And the immigrant experience, and again, since I'm from India, it is about the Indian immigrant experience. But embedded in that experience, I strongly feel and know that it's also the story of many immigrants who came at that time. And so on one level, my early years, I grew up in Queens for 12 years. The second part of the book is about the abrupt shift to India. At the age of 12, my mother in particular was very concerned that I was getting too Americanized. I might start dating, boys, or boys might be looking at me, and made the decision that we needed to go back to India. So the second part of the book is about my immersion in Indian culture, which was talk about culture shock. It was it talks particularly about the orthodoxy of Hinduism, which is very similar to the Hasidim among Jews, and how it particularly affects young girls. The puberty rights, the restrictions on movement, everything from the way you were dressed. I was used to wearing pedal pushers, and then all of a sudden now I had to wear half sari and cover myself up, and you become more aware.
Was your mom a traditional Indian woman?
Yes, she was.
In the U.S.?
Yes, she was.
Okay, so
she wore traditional in the way she dressed, but not in the way she thought.
So she was progressive, a little bit more liberal living in the United States, but still she wanted you to have the values.
Yes, there was a contradiction in my mother, in the sense is that after we settled in this country in the mid-1940s, she decided to, my mother was a well-educated woman, and then she decided to go for a master's in psychology at Queen's College, which was unheard of. In India, there's no adult learning, the thought of a woman in her 30s going to college, there's no opportunity, let me put it that way. And then my mother was the first Indian woman in that community that I grew up in to drive a car. And she played poker, and she played bridge, and, she liked to party. But when it came to me, she was very strict, very protective and strict. And then when as I said, the book is a lot about my challenge, or the challenges I faced to assimilate. when I went back to India. Not, feeling very American, but
in really formative years.
Yes.
We're talking starting at 12,
12,
right?
12.
And then being married at 16 or
Yes,
meeting
my
your
marriage was arranged after I moved back to India. I was going to school, so I sort of look at my school days, how different it was from my school days here, my friends, my attempt to, somehow become, part of the crowd when I went back. And then it then veers into what brought about my arranged marriage. My father passed away 3 years after we moved back. And my mother now, as a single woman, a widow in Hindu culture, there was pressure put on her. I'm the only daughter with two brothers. And, the notion that a woman cannot protect her daughter without a man. And my mother, even though she herself was married very late, for her time, my mother was 24, my dad was 33. And she felt that in order, again, at the time it seemed difficult, it was difficult for me to accept, but she felt that this was the best way to ensure that I would be taken care of the rest of my life.
What are the ages of your brothers?
My older brother is 3 years older than I am, and my older brother is actually 2.5 years older than I am. My younger brother is 3 years younger to me.
Mm-hmm. And were there similar pressures on them to be traditional?
No. For them, the adjustment would have been, I would say, more on the surface level, just being in another country, but their movements were not restricted. They could go freely anywhere that they wanted. I was chaperoned wherever I went.
Was that out of your own, like, to protect you? Or was that, protect you, like, physically from an assault? Or was that just really overprotection? Like from an overprotective mom?
Well, a lot of it is, again, the fact that a single, virgin girl being out alone courts danger. So, very much, that happened in Victorian England, in Europe, in Italy. It's not unique to India. So there were those kinds. Yes, I think the restrictions are more that to protect the girl's virginity. I think that is something of utmost, the chastity of the girl, because should she be, say, a victim of rape or even sexual assault without rape or even been touched by another man, the girl is immediately seen as tainted goods.
So there's no prospects for marriage.
Yes. Word, again, spreads like wildfire, and all of a sudden the girl acquires a bad reputation. She, is seen as almost the perpetrator of her own of her own attack, rather than, again, looking at what somebody else did to her. And this actually goes back a lot, where it's the woman's fault for being, you had it in this country before Me Too and all of that. It's like, well, even now you were wearing the wrong clothes, who asked you to drink so much? We still have those attitudes.
Sure.
And in India, what happens is your prospects of finding a groom or of a marriage ever being arranged, and at the time that I was growing up, arranged marriages were the norm. Well,
they're still very common today.
Yes. But, again, it's also a class, the case of people who are middle class, upper middle class, who have been exposed more to Western values. Those girls will just tell their parents, I'm not going to marry a boy unless I get to meet him. I see it's a generational difference because, I come from a Brahmin family, as does my husband, and on several recent trips to India, I was talking to his cousin's children. These are young girls in their 20s. Who are working.
This is in Madras?
Madras, Bangalore, they're South Indian families.
Mm-hmm. Not rural
areas.
Not rural.
These are urban girls who are well educated. and do want to get married, but now they impose their conditions. They tell, the prospective groom, when they go out, they meet with the person and say, I intend to work after marriage. And what are your views on that? I don't intend to have children right away. I want to continue working after children. Will you be able to make arrangements, provide the kind of childcare I need? And so a lot of that is laid out, which was very different from my time in the 60s when I got married.
I'm sure very different than 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yes, and the girls are more sure of what they want.
Well, there's probably more opportunity for them
there is.
as well.
There's more opportunity. There are a lot of women in leadership positions. People often have a perception of India, women being downtrodden and don't have a voice. And again, there's a big difference between the urban and the rural areas. But even in the rural areas, I find women have a lot of strength and control. There was many years ago where rural women stood up against the menfolk, drinking alcohol and abusing them. There have been women who are at the forefront of the so-called tree huggers, to prevent deforestation and the ruining of the land. If you look even for India's fight for independence, women were at the forefront. They just don't get the visibility that men do.
So the book covers your
covers
time
that, and my husband.
Your marriage.
Yes, and the interesting thing in my case was after we were engaged, my husband to be came to New York. He was doing his postdoc at NYU.
And we should just say that's Raghu, if that's
Raghu,
okay.
of course.
And you're still married to him.
Yes, 55 years.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
And so he had asked my mother if he could write to me since we didn't know each other at all. And of course, my mother talked to his father, because in India, the marriage is really between families. It's not between the boy and the girl. And his father said yes.
Which is kind of smart.
In some ways. Well, I often tell people, I'll finish with this, the parents agreed that he could write to me. And so he landed in New York sometime in September, right in time for when NYU opened. And we wrote to each other and actually, in a way, fell in love through our letters. There's a courtship section, which to me was I enjoyed writing the most. And I had saved the letters that we had sent each other. I remembered that I had saved them, and then I went digging and I found them in the plastic bag. And I took all the letters out and reread them. And I've included, portions of the letters. So over a night, we wrote between September and May. And he came back around the third week of May to marry me, which was in early June. And so the letters, show our growth, his views about marriage, his aspirations, I would say for the most part, trepidations about being married so young, not knowing what it meant. Then the book ends with the prelude to all the wedding ceremonies. Right. There's a little more humor towards the end of him taking me out on a so-called first date, and the marriage rituals itself. So it ends with that.
Yeah, that's why we need the continuation of it, because that's just such a small part, of your life.
It is. I mean, I don't know. I have been thinking about it. There's a part of me that feels that I might want to do it as a collection of essays rather than a whole book. I mean, and again, to be candid about it, I don't want to compromise either the privacy too of my son and my husband. I'm more willing, I suppose, to discuss private matters up to a point in public, and they're not that comfortable. And I want to be respectful of that, so that they don't feel, oh my God, did she have to put this?
Everything's on display.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that you had mentioned, I think early in the, just as we were talking, as we were recording about the book, that it's an immigrant's story. It's called, the subtitle is A Journey Between Two Worlds. And here you are, not only as an Indian living in the U.S., in the early part of your life, but then you're American, basically living in India. So you have this really difficult transition, kind of
Yes.
learning to navigate both worlds. Do you think that that story, that immigrant story, is typical of immigrants coming to the U.S.? Let's just stick with one country to make it easy. You said earlier something about it being in that time period, but do you think that it's as true today, or do you think it's easier for immigrants today because we have maybe technology, because there's maybe more fluidity, and other cultures are more gentrified also? You can go anywhere, pretty much anywhere, and find a Starbucks.
Right.
Do you think it's still as difficult for them, or do you think it's easier, the same?
I think it's easier. And there are a few reasons for that. Number one, as you mentioned, for better or for worse, Western culture, not necessarily just American, but Western culture, due to globalization, has made its presence known in, say, a country like India. So unlike when my mother came, she had no idea what America was. It was just a name. People have in their imaginations a sense of what America is. It's not as foreign to them as it was to my mother. That's, I think, a big difference. There has been more migration between, the East and the West than there has ever been. Everything from plane travel to using digital technology, all right, that you can connect across cultures more easily. The other thing that I think is a big difference is that there are about, I think, 2.5 million Indians in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. That certainly wasn't the case when my parents came. I mean, in New York City alone, there are close to 800,000 Indians. And so immigrants coming here can find, I would say, I don't know how to put it, but remnants of home in the United States. There are temples all over the United States, for people who want to worship, which was not, there wasn't a single Hindu temple when my parents arrived.
What about when you arrived, when you came back in 1964?
Yes, well, they had just, in the process of building like a Hindu temple in Queens. I don't know if it was completed at the time, but it was in the process. But frankly, my mother was shipping all the food stuff to me in steamer trunks. So all the lentils, tamarind,
spices.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
We would go to Chinatown to get cilantro because you couldn't find it in the supermarket. All right. So we'd go to Chinatown to get that, to get green chilies. There was maybe one, at the most two Indian stores. My husband was reminding me there was something called Java India, and we would go there. After a while, it just became too much to have everything shipped, But I remember as a new bride, my mother had sent a steamer trunk with all of the plates and the this. And then we found the store, Kalustyan, which is still there. And it was an Armenian run by a man called Kalustyan. We knew him. And he was the only person who had things like cumin, coriander. And we would, that's where we would shop.
So commonplace now.
I know.
Oh my gosh.
It's interesting. There was recently an interview with Indra Nooyi, who just stepped down, an Indian woman from Madras, who stepped down as the CEO of Pepsi. And in the interview, they had asked her, how was it when you came to the United States? And I guess she's, of course, much younger than I am. And I think she came to the United States in the 70s. And the first thing she said was, I had a hard time, finding curds, which is the Indian name for yogurt. And I write in the book about my mother's search for yogurt back in the 1940s when she came. And it just struck me, more than 30 years later, someone like her, when she came, she craved for that curd rice, that ends all the meals, in South India. And when she found out that it was yogurt, like her joy knew no bounds. See, the struggle sometimes takes place, in what I call the quotidian, in the day-to-day. You notice, well, I don't, eating Indian food off china plates is not the same as eating it off the
Of a
thali,
thali plate,
you know. So I think those kinds of issues are really not that dominant, you know, with the group that is coming. They're more sure of themselves, you know. I think, again, you know, whatever struggles, I mean, again, that they do face would probably be in not understanding how to negotiate maybe in the workforce in this culture or what is expected of them. I don't like to stereotype, you know, but a lot of Indians were sort of told to be very deferential, you know, not to speak up at work. And I think those are the kinds of things that new immigrants struggle with.
Right. And as Americans, we struggle with that going into other countries where we try to dominate a conversation because that's that's what we've learned to do. It's hard to unwind that going,
and there are a lot
going
more,
either way.
I mean, there's a big change. There are a lot more support groups for Indians, particularly women.
What kind of support groups?
Oh, there is an organization called Saki Manavi for women who sadly might be experiencing domestic violence at home or don't know what their rights are. They can go to these groups, you know, and provide support for them. You know, a friend of mine, her daughter is, she's of Indian origin, I should say, and she's a lawyer. And she's actually an ADA in Queens. And most of the work that she does is fight for immigrant rights. Because many of them, if their literacy level is low, have no idea what legal access or rights they have. They don't even know what the term rights mean. And so, I mean,
well, there's American women who don't know that either.
Exactly. But I'm saying there are a lot of organizations where women in particular can go. They now have community centers for elderly immigrants who come, parents of the children who, you know, the children go off to work and the parents are sitting at home and they feel lonely. They don't have the same community that they had back home. And so there are community centers now.
They don't have the maids and the cooks.
Exactly. Yeah, the good life.
I know, exactly. I know. I have a lot, you know, I've got a number of Indian friends, especially in Seattle, because of the technology. You know, so many Indians come for the technology, and that's what they say, is that they miss being in India, where life is hard in India. It is. It might take you 2 months to get electricity, you know, or a landline to your house. But you've got someone to do your laundry and someone to clean and cook for you.
No, I mean, again, even like traditional food, I mean, the rise of food blogs. Sometimes when I'm thinking, I want to make that traditional dish, I just go onto this website and it's all there.
Yeah.
You know, everything like your grandma used to make. All of those things, I think, I'm not saying the assimilation process is stress-free or without, difficulty. But there's certainly more ease of assimilation. Or I actually like to use the word acculturation, where, you know, assimilation sometimes I think most people feel it sort of homogenizes. You know, see, when I was growing up, you were either Indian or American. And this idea that you could be Indian American without the hyphen didn't exist. And I think now, you know, with this acculturation, you can retain the parts of your tradition that you value, and you can embrace American values as you see fit. I look at my life like that. You know, I always wear a sari and, you know, I look very traditional, and very often people think I'm very traditional till I open my mouth.
I know, until you say something.
I know. And then they go, did you really say that? You know? And, you know, when people speak to me in halting English, you know, do you speak English? And then
you say,
sure. No, I'm tempted. Okay. So, and then,
flipping the finger or something.
I mean, I go to Queens where I was brought up, and not far from where I live is Jackson Heights, which is the most diverse area in the entire United States. And certainly that was not the case. I mean, we go there, my husband and I, every 2 weeks to do our food shopping.
In Jackson Heights,
in
did
Jackson
you say?
Heights,
Yeah.
and I feel I'm back home. You know, there's
You feel comfortable?
very sari shops, food shops, you know,
Well,
everything.
I was gonna ask you about the saris and the availability of things, and also just with new immigrants, or even just an immigrant maybe who's been here a long time, a woman. Do you know many women? Do you see many women who are wearing saris?
No, that even changed when I came back here. You know, I think it was probably in the 70s, early 80s, I would say. You know, I think finishing up my PhD work, and I was going into the workforce, or planning to go into the workforce. And I have to say, and this is something I do want to write about, is when I did go to interview, people saw the sari and never saw the woman behind the sari. Most of the questions I got were, even though it was illegal on the books, people felt bold enough to ask the type of questions, sort of euphemistically couched, you know, in language, things like, oh, students must be awfully surprised when you walk into the classroom, with the emphasis on you. And it took a while before I could sort of read what's called the subtext, you know, and a lot of it was, well, how do they respond to you looking the way you do? And you know, that came up in quite a few places where I interviewed. And at one point, I remember being very angry and frustrated, and said, how would students respond if somebody came in, you know, with a micro mini skirt? What does that have to do with anything? And I remember, I mean, again, you know, it took me a long time to find a job. I didn't get the job that I wanted, which was to be sort of a member of the faculty at a university. It was very frustrating, depressing. It made me angry. And I remember friends of mine saying, you know, well, if you get rid of the sari and the bindi and cut your hair, you know, you could pass. You could, you know, they might think, you know, you're Italian, or maybe you're, you know.
Wow.
And I remember bristling when I heard these comments. And I said, why do I have to compromise who I am in order to find a job? And many of my friends did. They took off the sari, they wore Western clothes, and the sari became something that they would just wear on
For
special occasions.
When they came to your house.
Yeah, not even. You know, many of them didn't even wear that when they came. You know, it would be like, you know, a concert, or, you know, some public gathering where they didn't feel uncomfortable. That was the sad thing. I've always felt comfortable in a sari. I've traveled all over the world. I have gone, except for the South, in Florida as a South as a god. I've traveled all over, you know, in my sari. And yes, people stare, and I think they're...
Do they even here in New York?
Not in New York. You know, I mean, if you see what people wear in New York or don't wear, I actually look normal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's just when you're in your yoga pants, that's the only time somebody...
I know. Then they look at me. Isn't
Yeah.
that funny?
Yeah.
You know, then they all say, is that you? You know?
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk about that you had mentioned before, and now I can't even remember if it was before we started recording. You had mentioned your process of actually writing the book, having come back, and you spent a summer writing. And I'm so interested in the process, because I'm working on a book, and it's been a long process, and it's a painful process too. I mean, it's painful on a lot of levels. It's painful because it's very time consuming, and you have to sit down and really have your head into it without a lot of distractions for an extended period of time. And it doesn't have to be, it's never 8 hours for me. But even a couple of hours is a really difficult thing, you know, to sit down and do a chunk of time. But how did you find that time and kind of clear your calendar to work through it? And how many years was it that you were working on it?
Well, it was a lot. I mean, it sort of goes back, you know, and I do say, you know, I had lost my older son, Gopal, in the 9/11 attacks.
Well, since you brought that up, can you talk about that first? Just what happened?
Yeah, he was, working at Cantor Fitzgerald, and he had gone to work that day like everybody else.
And he had just started the job a
Yes,
month prior?
he had started the job. I guess it was sometime in July or August. He hadn't really been there for hardly a month. He had been on Wall Street since he got out of college. He graduated from NYU. He knew he wanted to go into Wall Street, and he was successful. He was very bright and very creative. Music was really his passion. He had his own band called City Beat, and he played in CBGBs, which is now no more. But he was he went to the Bronx High School of Science, then he went to NYU. So he was a city kid throughout. He was inseparable from New York. He loved, as he said, the vibe of the city. So he joined Wall Street, and then I think it was in the year 2000, he decided to leave Wall Street, and he wanted to start his own company. And he did. It was called Site Groups, and it was interesting. It's sort of, in my mind, I don't know if everybody would. I think my younger son disagree in the way I'm phrasing it. I'm not that good about business stuff, but he started something in where people in businesses could link up with one another, almost like LinkedIn today. And he was very creative about it, but long story short, the dot-com bubble burst, at the end of that year, and very sadly, he had to fold his company. So he took some time off to reconsider whether he really wanted to go back to Wall Street. He was toying with the idea of teaching. He was very articulate, had a great sense of humor, and was very good in teaching people how to do things. And then again, being young, he was, 32 at the time. You can't be sitting at home all day. And so I think in a way, kind of reluctantly, he joined Cantor Fitzgerald, and everybody very sadly perished that day in that office. No one survived. He was trapped on the 104th floor, so there was no escape. And anyway, as time, a few years passed after that, I continued working. I went back to work, in fact, 2 weeks after it happened. I was working at an administrative position at the time, and I was also teaching. So I went back to work, and then I went to India. I can't quite remember. I have to be frank, a lot of my memory is very hazy, I think, from the trauma and the grief. But I went back to India, and I'm guessing it was in either 2004 maybe, or I don't remember the exact date. But anyway, and I went to the temple that you took your tour group, in Srirangam in Trichy. Outside Trichy, and I had a darshan there. And I'm not a very religious person, but during that process, I almost felt as if God was talking to me and saying something like, when you go back, you will find something that will give you a sense of reward and peace. And I kept thinking, what could that be? I've been a college professor for 35 years now, and that has been the only profession I know. And I've always been, I guess, in what you would call like a caregiver. I give to my students, I give to my husband, I give to my children, and I very rarely give to myself. So when I came back, I said, what is it, Vasu, that you're so passionate about? And it's always been writing. And I did write as a child. And prior to losing my son, I had written for two of India's papers. And then I dabbled in some pieces that got published. But I never pursued it as, I would say, even as a career. It was something that I did that I loved doing. I'd get an idea in my head and I would sit down and write. Anyway, in this case, then I said, my God, it's been so long since I've even touched my writing. And I took a creative nonfiction class at NYU. And part of my reason for that was I wanted to be in a milieu where nobody knew me. After 9/11, many people identified me as a 9/11 mother. I would often hear people say, oh, the Indian woman in a sari, she's the one who lost her son. And
In what context? Like when you were out at an
yeah, just in
event
this
or
community. I live in the NYU community, and people were hesitant to look me in the eye, and I would hear them. Many people didn't even know my name. They just knew I was the Indian woman in a sari, whose son had died. Many people didn't even know his name. Without getting into all the 9/11 politics, it was such a public tragedy. It was very difficult for me to grieve individually for my son or personally. Every time his name came up, it was under the context of the Bush administration or the war in Afghanistan, going after bin Laden, and nobody knew what Al Qaeda was, all of that kind of stuff. And somehow my son got lost in that conversation. So I wanted to just enter a space where nobody knew I was a 9/11 mother. They would just have to look at me, Indian woman entering the class with a sari, there to write. And I, I went to a couple of classes not knowing what to expect. And then I really loved the teacher. She made you write every week. There were no excuses. You could not come into her class without a piece of writing. And I liked the atmosphere. We, ranged in age from late 20s to people who were even older than I am, people who were in their 80s. And everybody had something to share. And it just got my juices going, my creative juices. Anyway, after at the end of the course, and there were bits of this memoir that had found itself into the course in some of my writings. And the teacher took a special interest. She came up to me after the class and she said, and she didn't know about my son, wanted to know a little bit more about me. And then she said, you have her words were, I had a great style of writing. And she said, have you ever thought of publishing your work? And I said, no. I said, I was doing this really to kind of heal. I said, I wanted to immerse myself in something very different from what I normally do, somewhere where all that mattered was me and my words. And in any case, she did take an interest in me, and we started to work together. And that's how my memoir began. And it was in bits and pieces. I wrote long chapters. There was no, I don't know what word, I wouldn't say, there was coherence within the piece, but the pieces were not necessarily connected. So it was a long process. I think we started, I don't know, I'm trying to think, maybe in 2004, 5, around there. I really have to say I didn't see it as a book. Somehow I found it very difficult. I wrote these pieces about, going to school in New York and going to school in India. And I had no idea in my mind how I was going to connect these threads, I would say, in my life. But working with her, she was a superb critic. What I appreciated the most about Carol Bergman, was she didn't mince her words. She had this intuitive sense to know when I was struggling on the page. There were times when I gave her stuff and my heart had not been in it, but because I'm a disciplined person, I would churn something out and she would say, where are you in this piece? And I've been a long time academic, and I think the hardest thing for me was to take off that academic hat and write the way I felt. I often couched my feelings about what was going on in language in which my voice was very removed. That was the biggest struggle I faced, because memoir writing is extremely difficult. You do have to excavate a lot of painful memories, which I had to do. But one of the things, when you were talking about the writing process, and not to be too circuitous, but I've said this at a few readings I gave recently. The Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk had won the Nobel Prize in Literature. I believe it was in 2006. And they reprinted his lecture in the New Yorker. It's called My Father's Suitcase, which I highly recommend to anybody who wants to write or is a writer. And one of the things that he said that struck me was, that writing allows you to conjure up a second being for yourself and give life to that second self. He said,
in a way, it's kind of your first self, though, isn't it?
well, there's the self on the outside, all right? I mean, when I mean a second being, it's a being that you have given birth to and has not been imposed on you. Being a daughter, being a wife, being a mother, being a teacher, those are roles that are defined both institutionally, culturally, traditionally. But this self that he talks about is within your control. And you conjure that second being inside of you the way you want. It's not because somebody said, you have to write it this way. I had the freedom. One of the things he says, you are in the company of words. And I just love that phrase. And I did not want to be in any other company. I did not want to talk about my son. I did not want to talk about 9/11. I did not want to talk about my grief. I wanted, in some sense, to be in a space where if I felt like crying, I cried. If I felt like, being joyful, I could be joyful. There was nobody looking over my shoulder. And that is how I began really to think about the memoir in terms of a trajectory from my childhood to India. I would really say that's when things began to, I would say the narrative began to take shape in my mind. And I did bring a discipline to it. I mean, I know maybe it's old-fashioned, but you need to be disciplined to be a writer. And I'm an avid reader. And I talk about it in the book. My father introduced me to the love of the English language. I do think in English. It is my first language, having been brought up here. And what I found is, and this is some advice I can give you, Beth, if you don't mind.
Please do.
Is to set aside a fixed time every day, whether it's 2 hours, 1 hour, half an hour, and just write. It doesn't have to even be something pertaining to your larger project. Even if it's 2 sentences, it's that act of writing. And there were days when I didn't get beyond 2 paragraphs, but I was very happy with the paragraphs I wrote. And so I did. When I started writing this in earnest, I would say I would start at 10 in the morning, go until 12, take a lunch break, go back, and write until nearly 4 or 4:30. And I would tell my husband not to come home, not to call me. I did not answer the phone. I did not look at email. There are even programs now that prevent you from looking at email when you write. Yeah. I didn't have all of that, but I did discipline myself. And once my, husband and other obligations came into play, I, in some sense, never stopped thinking about my writing, but I did not want to feel frustrated. Sometimes when you're like really writing something and then whoever is in your life comes home, you go, oh my God, I can't give this. I didn't want to do that. So I won't say I turned my mind off. That would be wrong. My mind was still churning with language, but I did not write. I just didn't go to the computer. I would jot things down on a pad and say, a sentence would come into my mind and I would say, yeah, that's a sentence I need to put in there, or whatever the case may be. And so discipline is key. I really think you have to discipline yourself to carve out that time. And for me, it was a fixed time every day. Like I didn't change it. Like I didn't do like after dinner to midnight. Right. I'm a morning person. Maybe that has to do with it.
Yeah, I am too. Yeah, it's that quiet.
It is
nice quiet time.
But I had to shut out a lot of social activities. I did have to tell friends, I'm sorry, I can't make it for coffee or lunch. I'm writing. And then there were days that I gave myself a break. I wasn't a fanatic about it. I couldn't afford to be. I had other things that I needed. I was teaching. I had to prepare for classes. But when I carved the time, when I was not at school and everything else, I learned to prioritize and put my writing first. And that's how I got through it. And as I was telling you, in the process of editing and revising for publication, I was at it at about 6 to 7 hours a day.
Wow, that's a lot.
It was summer. I didn't have any obligations, but I was determined, and I had 350 pages. I had to go through line by line, word for word, but I did.
I have a couple of books under the Wanderlust and Lipstick brand, and those are how-tos. And it was relatively easy for me to be disciplined about those books because it was research and writing and how-tos and this, and in many ways not personal. And the book I'm working on now is personal. And
can I ask what it
Yeah, Be Bold, Discover Your Best Self Through Travel and Adventure.
Oh, okay.
And so it's basically a memoir of my travels and growing up in New Jersey and getting out of New Jersey and away from, family and finding myself through travel and now through more athletic activities too, and just how I've grown through that process. But in writing the Wanderlust and Lipstick books, like I said, relatively easy, but sitting down and opening up not only 30 years worth of journals that I have from my travels. Like I'm sure you're so grateful that you never threw away those letters that you had, because there were many times when I thought, I will never look at these travel journals. I should just get rid of them. And now I open them up and I realized they weren't as bad as I thought they were. You know what I mean? Like I just thought, I wrote silly things then. But there were actually some very mature reflections that I had from those travels. And I've been able to pull that out, which has been really helpful. But at the same time, doing that deep dive is so painful.
Yes.
It's looking at yourself in the rearview mirror is not always a pretty sight, or looking at family or relatives.
You have to see yourself warts and all, I think they say.
Yes, you do. But it is, I think I've said this before. It's like, I think every person should sit down and write their life story and spend that time, that disciplined time, because you get to know yourself so well.
Many people are afraid. I mean, the other thing too that you might want to, be aware of when you're doing this type of writing, going back in time, is
get a therapist.
No, I didn't get it. Writing was my therapy.
Yeah,
but
true.
No, the other thing too is there's a tendency to look at your past with the commentary of the present. And I think, for example, like when I was writing about my mother, I felt a huge amount of guilt in some of the chapters. I portray her as rather cold and withholding, I would say, not that she was without feeling. And I remember thinking, I know my mother passed away many years ago. Do I really want to write about her this way? And one of the things, that I learned is you have to write, if you can, about how you felt at the time that something happened, rather than from a distance. Like I've always hero worshipped my father, for example, and he could do no wrong. But when I was writing, I realized how much of an absentee father he was and how that deeply hurt me as a child, not having a father around. And how even into adulthood, the one thing that has always, I think that I'm afraid of is a fear of abandonment. Like when my husband started traveling a lot after our marriage, I would say it was like a rocky time for us. There was this feeling about that's not what I signed up for. And so that's something when you're reading your earlier journals, you have to reimagine yourself as to who you were at the time you wrote them. And rather than look upon it now with Beth in 2019, but who was Beth in whenever that year was.
And also the cultural influences at that time too.
Yes,
It's like what we had access to and the information and the things that were acceptable at that time too. I think about that to bring back the Me Too, bring up the Me Too topic, is that, things happened like the Al Franken thing. I think that happened ages ago.
Right.
And at the time it might have been appropriate or okay behavior. And now this is coming back and biting people in the butt, for things that were culturally acceptable at one point. And now we look back at it horrified. And it's the same thing as reflecting on ourselves, as you point out. That not only are we different to our core, but the entire culture is different. Completely.
Yes. I mean, now, in my age, when I look back at what my mother did, in some ways I'm grateful. I mean, like I tell people, they don't pick like some Joe Schmo when you have an arranged marriage. They research the person and they want to make sure they're choosing the best person for you, even if it's, it doesn't mean you don't have a say. And I understand a lot of that now, as a mother myself, and just life experience. But I had to write how I felt at the time, and that was a struggle. There were just times when, I have to say, when I was writing about my father and his sudden death, I mean, I just openly wept in front of the computer because I never cried for him. After he died, there was just so much and people coming and going. That process of grief hit me.
And you were young.
I was very young.
Too. It's probably difficult. You were 15 then?
No, when my dad died, I was just about to turn. I was just about to turn 15. I was 14.
Yes. Yeah. So, and that's a lot to process.
Oh, it was a lot. I mean, I talk about it. It's called chaos, appropriately enough for that chapter. But those are things that, when you reread what you wrote. See, the other advice I give you too is don't correct as you go along. I, being a stickler for good English, would constantly reread my sentences and go, I don't know, did I get the right,
Right.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Dangling participles.
Right. You just have to do a little brain dump. That's what it is.
And then, I remember my writing mentor saying, will you stop worrying about all of that now, and so those are things, little things that you can sort of pay attention to as you write. Yeah, it's important to get it down there.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of your mom and kind of reflecting on her, would you say that she, in your opinion, today and then, did you see her as bold?
Yes, I did.
Did you see her as bold?
Yes, the word I would use with my mother was she was an iconoclast. That's the word I would use because, number one, she stood up against her father and refused to get married at a young age. Her own mother, my grandmother, was married when she was 9 or something, And my mother was way beyond her prime, quote unquote. She was 24. And my grandfather, her father, did not want to educate her beyond school, high school. And my mother actually ran away to her uncle's house and said, I'm going to educate myself. And that was unheard of. And then the uncle interceded on her behalf with my grandfather and said, I'll keep an eye on her, protect her, this and that. And so, this was a well-known story in our family, that my mother fought to get her education, which was unheard of. My mother was born in 1919. Here she was fighting for her right to be educated. And then she worked. My mother was a college teacher. She majored in history. And she met my father, and he was ahead of his time. He did not want a dowry. He said, I just want to marry. And my grandfather was thrilled. I don't have to pay for this one, because he had 2 other daughters. And then when my mother came to this country, she was the first Indian woman in her sari to learn how to drive a car. And she would, take all the other Indian women who were afraid to ride the subway, didn't know what was out there. My mother She was a diplomat's wife. My father was a UN diplomat. She learned, how to mingle with UN diplomats' wives. And, most of the diplomats were men at the time.
So very sophisticated
Yes.
and not intimidated by
Not
the environment.
at all, which is why her treatment towards me is in stark contrast to her own life. I mean, one of the conditions I had when my marriage was arranged, I said, what about my education? And I do write about that in the book, and my mother was, I'll make sure he educates you. And if he doesn't, I'll take you back, educate you, and then send you back to him. And, here I was in love with this man, and I didn't want to be apart from him. And the one thing that I was extremely, worried and scared about is that I would never get educated beyond high school. And I must say, Raghu did get me admission at NYU, and I've been at NYU.
Do you feel a responsibility to your mother? Like, is it a very cognizant thing for you that you still wear a sari, that you got a good education, and that you are a professor? Do you feel like in some ways that you're channeling your mom?
I think, to be fair, I would say that I've achieved what I've achieved on my own merit, that I'm one of these people who's ambitious and was very mindful of the fact, and again, frustrated that I didn't get to achieve what I wanted to achieve when I wanted to achieve it. I did have to put my career ambitions on hold to be a wife, and I was a stay-at-home mom when the kids were young. But with my husband's travel, a lot of the household duties I felt unfairly fell on me. So in that sense, I think I get the drive from my mother.
Mm-hmm. And I shouldn't say channeling her as in she gave you the gift of anything in particular, but more of a responsibility to achieve because you saw that in her.
I guess I would just rephrase it and say that I saw my mother as a role model. I don't know if I would use the word that I felt responsible towards her. No, I never thought that. To be frank with you, I did everything for me. I wanted that undergraduate degree. I wanted my master's. I wanted my PhD. And I was determined to do whatever I had to do to get it. I actually, when my mother came to visit me, she actually thought very little of my wanting to do the PhD. She actually would say, what is all this studying about? You've already got, at that time I had 2 master's degrees. And she said, what more do you want?
Okay.
And I'm being frank, my mother was very intelligent, but I don't know how to put it. She was not highly intellectual. And I don't want to sound boastful, but I saw myself as an intellectual.
Well, it's funny. One of the things that I had just written down kind of in my notes here is that I see you and Raghu as an intellectual power couple.
Other people have said that, to be honest with you. They have.
So, yeah. So that's not an original thing
no,
there. But
I had a thirst for learning that my mother, again, I don't want to belittle, her accomplishments. But my mother was more pragmatic. When she got the degree in counseling and went back to India, it was no use. Nobody knew what even counseling was. So she did. She went back to school and she found a program in library science, of all things. And she got trained as a librarian and became the chief librarian in the Madras Secretariat, which is a high position. And my mother read a lot, but my mother did not read academic books. I thirsted for knowledge in other disciplines. I would read books on art, on philosophy, sociology. And don't forget, I married into an academic community. I live in an NYU community. And I had the resources of the university at my fingertips. So I took advantage of that. I read stuff of, people my mother's never heard of. My dad was an intellectual. My mother was extremely intelligent, but I would hesitate to use the word intellectual with her. And so I have to say that, not to sound egocentric or selfish, but all my education I didn't do to please anybody else but myself. I took pride in my who I was. And that is to this day too.
Do you think that that came from your dad then? Or where did
Yes,
that,
I think
that confidence and that desire?
because my father was an avid reader, and he did, and again, I even talk about it in the book. He didn't allow comic books in the house or anything. My father was a very sophisticated reader. For a young man who came from a middle class background, he made it a point to educate himself. And I think that's where I derive my love for language, my thirst for knowledge. I'm not a very pragmatic person. To me, that is my world. And that is why I'm also eternally grateful to be an educator. And that's what I like to instill in my students, is the desire to know.
And to have an informed
Yes.
position on things.
And not to feel that if you Google it, you know it.
Is there anything, as we just kind of wrap up here, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to talk about, explain, or something that might be on your mind?
I just think, again, and I've often said this, is that not to be defeated by adversity. Many people have often said, how are you able to do what you do? And yes, I could have succumbed to my grief. I mean, it was, horrible what I had to endure. But I refused to give in to that. I really felt that each of us, and I think particularly women, Beth, because I think sometimes they're afraid to summon what's deep inside of them. That deep inside all of us, there is perhaps something dormant, something that we can awaken, and we can give life to it. It's again going back to that second being. I think that resides in all of us. And I think too often women don't summon that second being because there are always other demands on them.
Sure, they're taking care of the kids,
Yes.
the family, and the house.
And for me, as I said, I was able to put all those other roles aside. And again, I have other women friends who have suffered tragedies as well. Not necessarily 9/11, but have lost their child also under, brutal circumstances. And, one of them is an artist and channels, her sadness, etc., in her art, but it's beautiful art. The other one is a jewelry maker. And in every piece she creates, she finds a certain release, a certain comfort, a certain way of looking at herself, and can say proudly, I make jewelry, The other one can say, I'm an artist. And now I feel I can finally say I'm a writer. That's what I would say.
I'm so sorry you had to go through the loss of Gopal for that.
Yes, I was telling my husband, in fact, that I wish I had discovered the writer in me earlier. But I will tell you, I have no regrets about the career that I chose. I'm torn. I'm truly blessed that I entered a profession and never had to change. I did not have to give up my sari or my bindi and sit in a corporate office and make money. I never made a lot of money, but the rewards go way beyond that. And many of my students, even though I knew you as a student, continued to be in my life. And there are very few professions where that happens. So I'm truly very fortunate. And I'm also fortunate that at my age, I've been able to produce this book, and that people seem to have taken to it, and that it speaks to a lot of people across different spectrums.
It does. Beyond the immigrant.
Yes, it is.
But beyond that, there is something about it that just really draws you in. And I don't think it's just because I know you, and it's not just because I have an interest in India or that I'm open to learning about the immigrant experience. There is just something about it that's fascinating, really. Just
Well, thank you
so
for
well
saying
written.
that.
Yeah. When I wrap up these conversations with people, I always ask, what does it mean to you to be bold?
For me, to be bold is to never give up on the goals I have set for myself. Ambition sometimes is seen as a pejorative word, but I am ambitious for my mind to grow. And no matter what obstacles and sudden life changes like I've undergone, whether it be going from one culture to the other or having an arranged marriage and sadly to lose a child, I never forsook, I think is the right word, my goals in life. I continued. I do it now sometimes thinking that my son would never want me to be a quitter. So to be bold for me is not to quit on yourself. And it also, I think, is to be able to change the lives of others. I think that takes a lot of chutzpah. Sometimes I think I'm a little too pushy when I do this, but I've had a lot. My teaching career has spanned a lot of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And my first job interview in Kingsborough College, I'll just wrap up with this, but the chairman, when he interviewed me, said, "You speak impeccable English, and I'm giving you the dregs of society to teach." And I looked at him thinking, what chairman speaks about, the students in this way? And I just, again, my first job, so I kept quiet. And I kept thinking, what does he mean, the dregs of society? Here I was coming from Soho, Manhattan to Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. I was thinking, oh my God, what kind of... Well, I walked into that classroom. They didn't even bat an eyelash looking at me in a sari. And I tell you, those students, not many made it, nothing to do with the course, but, other circumstances. But they were not at all the dregs of society. And some of them kept in touch with me for nearly 20 years after I taught there to tell me they remembered every book I had taught them, ideas I had taught them. And who would have thought that? And to me, that's what I mean. Now, don't be afraid to go in there and change. And I'm not talking, propaganda, that kind of change.
Sure.
But allowing students to see what they can be rather than who they are. I think they need somebody, a mentor, someone who can say that to them. And I used to be afraid to tell students that. I used to think, oh my God, who am I? Sometimes Raghu would say to me, not everybody values, what you value, Vasu. And I would say, but I want them to value it. And again, I'm talking about lofty ideas and ideals. And I haven't given up on that. And my students will often tell me, they said, oh my God, you drove me nuts. This is after they graduate, of course. But they always come back.
Yeah.
And they said, to this day, I get emails. I'll never forget. I can't forget what you taught us and the confidence. So,
well, we've stayed in touch all these years.
Yes.
Too, right?
And look at you.
For 35 years.
You have flourished.
And you too. One quick thing that I want to say is that when I was asking about your mom and kind of maybe your responsibility or what you felt, maybe channeling her or doing things with her in mind, you just said it about Gopal. You said he wouldn't want me to go on. So so there is that.
Yes.
There's that aspect of it, that if that's what, I'm not saying that that's what drives you, but that's in the back of your mind. That's what I was looking for with your mom. I was thinking, but it's the other way around. You've got...
No, because as I said, many people I know who lost somebody that day. I was in a support group for a while. Many of them very sadly let their lives crumble. I just did not want that to be me. And, and I have a very loving husband that has helped me. And really, I have my students. I have a very small group of good friends. And I've learned to be, my own best company sometimes. And I still find joy and refuge in books. Books have been my lifeline. And as I said, the writing. And, I didn't write this book to get a name or be a bestseller or even make money. None of those things. This story had been churning inside of me for years. And I'm just, so happy that I was able to kind of give birth to all that journey.
Yeah. So again, it's On My Own Terms, A Journey Between Two Worlds, and that can be found online.
It's on Amazon, Kindle, yep.
Right, great. Well, I encourage people to pick up a copy of that. And Vasu, thank you so much for your time. I know we've been trying to get together for a while, but the timing's perfect because of the book having come out. We tried to get together last year.
Joy to see you again.
I know, thanks.
Thank you.
Isn't she lovely? Please pick up a copy of her book. It is so beautifully written. I know you'll just thoroughly enjoy it. You can find On My Own Terms, A Journey Between Two Worlds on Amazon or request it at your local bookseller. I'll link to it in the show notes as well, so you can have easy access to that. For links to the book and for links to all the things that we chatted about in this episode, go to shesboldpodcast.com/episodes, and there you will find the show notes for this and all of my other conversations. You can also find those links and show notes in whatever podcast app it is you're using to listen to this. Don't forget to check out that Patreon page. Supporters will find out what Vasu would like to do in her alternative career. You can find out more by going to shesboldpodcast.com/Patreon. You can also sign up for the She's Bold podcast newsletter from the site's homepage, and that will alert you to new episodes each time they come out. You can connect with me by friending me on Facebook, and I'm WonderGal on Instagram. I'm also Beth Whitwa, BETHWHITWA on Instagram. So I've got those two accounts. Ladies, you can join the Be Bold Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Be Bold group for support and encouragement for whatever ways you're trying to be bold. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. Until next time, be bold.